Welcome to the London History Podcast. I am Hazel Baker from londonguidedwalks.co.uk. Step back in time with us as we journey into the heart of London's Seven Dials in the 1920s and 1930s. A neighbourhood unlike any other, bursting with colour, diversity and drama. In this episode, we uncover the untold stories and simmering tensions that define Seven Dials as it became a crossroads for migrant communities, working-class families and Bohemian nightlife. Here, vibrant cafés rubbed shoulders with jazz clubs and market stalls, while the spectre of urban improvement threatened to reshape everything familiar. I am thrilled to be joined by Professor Matt Holbrooke, a leading authority in cultural history and professor at University of Birmingham. Today, we're here to dive into his latest work, Songs of Seven Dials, an intimate history of 1920s and 1930s London. Drawing on vibrant archival research, the book explores the untold history of Seven Dials. Through the lens of remarkable residents and the turbulent events that shaped their lives, Professor Holbrooke guides us through the struggles over race, class, identity, and the contested making of modern London. Welcome, Matt.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
And this is one of the eras that we don't very often cover in London History Podcast, mainly because I think it's one of those eras that we don't really consider it history. It was 100 years ago, but it still doesn't feel mentally that long.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. Perhaps it feels very familiar to us that a lot of the things that we take for granted today, from Britain's status as a mass democracy through to different kinds of nightlife and mass culture, came into being in the 1920s and the 1930s. And when we look at pictures, color pictures, moving pictures even of the period, it all just looks closer than perhaps it is. In lots of ways, that's what got me interested in the period. I think it's been overlooked by historians, by popular histories until very recently. Misunderstood as well, if it hasn't been overlooked. And I think so. It's one of the things that I've tried to do in my career, and this book is just another example of that, is to try and think about how so much of what we take for granted about modern Britain actually came into being in the 20s and 30s. That if it looks familiar, it doesn't really seem 100 years ago. That's because it's the moment at which our world started to come into being and be recognizably modern in many ways.
And what drew you particularly to the area of Seven Dials?
There are different ways to answer that question. I think the book, Songs of Seven Dials, it takes as its starting point a libel trial in which a Sierra Leonean cafe owner called Jim Kitten and his wife, Emily Kitten, who's born in the very, very poor neighbourhood in the East End of London, do an unpleasant right-wing newspaper called John Bull for libel after the newspaper publishes a series of really horrible racist articles about their cafe in the 1920s. And I think what struck me about the case is, on the one hand, it's really the presence of a couple like Jim and Emily Kitten in a place like Seven Dials is completely normal. It's ordinary in the 1920s and the 1930s. But there's an extraordinary part to the story, which is that they do take that kind of unusual step of suing a national newspaper for libel. And then their cafe, generates questions in the House of the Parliament, questions to the Home Secretary, Sir William Johnson Hicks, about the regulation of London's nightlife, but also crucially about whether or not there is a kind of a colour bar at work in Britain and the British Empire. And so I suppose I came to Seven Dials from a roundabout route. I wanted to understand the cafe. I wanted to understand how something mundane ended up becoming so remarkable. And turned out, after kind of many years of working and thinking about the case, it turned out that understanding the libel trial and understanding why this cafe and not others generated questions in Parliament actually takes you to a very local history about urban improvement, about gentrification, about the clash between rich and poor, and this sort of battle to define what modern London will be.
How did Seven Dials differ from other parts of London at the time then in terms of diversity and community spirit?
Seven Dials is really interesting. It's one of the running jokes amongst authors of various sort, Agatha Christie and people like that in the 20s, is that no one really knows where Seven Dials is. They often, there's a kind of a line in Agatha Christie's novel, The Seven Dials Mystery, where a character just assumes or thinks that Seven Dials is in the East End. I think that's revealing. The Seven Dials is clearly today in the heart of the West End, sandwiched between Covent Garden, Soho, and Bloomsbury. But in many ways, in the 1920s and the 1930s, its population, its kind of character is much more like Limehouse or somewhere like that. It's mostly working class. Its population is exceptionally diverse. It has residents and small business owners from across Britain and Ireland, from France or Belgium or Eastern Europe, across the British Empire. It's a place of small workshops and eating houses and cafes, and actually quite big factories making metal pipework or boxes or paints or glues. I think in the context of London as a whole, it's not necessarily that distinctive. What makes it stand out, and what in many ways makes it, I think, feel and appear like an island in the middle of the West End, is that all of these things are taking place so close to the center of kind of mass culture and consumerism in London. And that, I think, is what makes it quite distinctive. Crime writers often talk about how they can taste a change in the air as they cross into Seven Dials precincts. And that's poetic license, of course, and people and goods and objects move in and out of Seven Dials all the time. But I think it does hint at a bigger truth that by the time of the 1910s and the 1920s, Seven Dials is almost the kind of an island in the heart of the West End. It's the place where it's like the backstage to the front stage of Theatreland. It's the place where the porters who work at Covent Garden Market live rather than work. I think that's what makes it interesting.
Now, you mentioned this libel trial in 1927 with the cafe owner. Why was it such a turning point for the neighbourhood?
Yeah, I don't think it's a turning point in a good way. But I think the best way of thinking about the libel trial is as a moment at which a lot of simmering conflicts, bubble over and come to a head. So Seven Dials, at the end of the First World War, Seven Dials is poor, it's working class, and it's declining. So it's an area which is still carrying the legacies of its reputation as a Victorian slum. At the same time, in that kind of giddy period after the First World War, the West End is expanding. So property developers, theatrical entrepreneurs are looking for places to build new theatres, new office blocks, new department stores. And at the same time, also, Covent Garden Market had run out of space. And so market traders looking for warehousing and wholesale space. And they start to look north at Seven Dials. So what begins to happen, and I think the conflict around Jim and Emily Kitten's cafe is as property developers and politicians start to get big ideas about what Seven Dials might become. Property is cheap. It's close to the West End. It's close to Covent Garden. And so it just looks like a really good opportunity to develop this working class area in ways that would transform it to a kind of plaza to rival Piccadilly Circus, for example. So that's I think, the underlying conflict, the sort of desire of property developers and politicians to turn a place of work and home into a kind of space of upscale consumerism or office work. I think what happens in the libel trial is that these kind of tensions become bound up with kind of particular local conflicts within the neighborhood. And the series of articles published by the newspaper John Bull are really part of a bigger campaign to push working class communities, particularly Black working class communities out of Seven Dials. And I think one way of reading the libel trial, partly Jim and Emily Kitten are trying to protect their reputation and their business. The articles in John Bull just destroy their takings over the course of 1926. But they're also, in many ways, trying to stand up for or to protect a really important Black and Asian social hub in the heart of central London.
So how did issues of race and you mentioned the colour bar shape everyday life in Seven Dials during this period?
That is a really good question. I think there are two different ways of answering that question about the colour bar. One is when Jim and Emily Kitten set up the cafe and begin to cater for a clientele, a really diverse clientele that includes loads of people who live and work in Seven Dials itself, but also Black and Asian sailors or students or jazz musicians from across London. What they're doing is trying to create a sort of social space in the context of kind of a commercial nightlife where things are increasingly difficult for Black and Asian people. There's a kind of moment during the First World War where, to fight the war, Britain summons up the kind of the people and the resources of empire. And many thousands of Black and Asian people respond to that call, serving in the merchant navy, for example. But there's also then a really virulent post-war reaction, a racist reaction against the Black and Asian presence in Britain. The most obvious example of that are the kind of the violent race riots, what are called race riots, in 1919, which take place in port towns and cities across Britain. Normally started by white sailors, normally to do with sort of competition over jobs in the shipping industry. But in the aftermath of those riots, there's a growing effort by the government and also a whole range of media entrepreneurs to define Black and Asian Britons as somehow alien or unwanted or other, an alien presence in a land where they don't belong. Now that's true that Black and Asian Britons, citizens of empire, have the right to live and work in Britain. But there's a growing effort in the 1920s to push them out, to exclude them from Britain, both legally and also through the kind of newspaper articles, the sort of really virulent newspaper rhetoric that you see in the newspaper John Bull. So I think the cafe, in a way, is a kind of commercial cultural response to political change and legislative change in a period when it's increasingly difficult for Black and Asian Britons to find somewhere to socialize, to gather, to stay, or to drink, or to eat. This is a kind of home from home. And it's quite clear from reading the testimony of the cafe's customers. That's how they experience it. There's nowhere else that will let them relax in quite the same way. And that's why it becomes so popular. But the cafe itself is a response to the colour bar. At the same time, I think the way that the cafe is treated, it very quickly becomes the focus of quite intrusive patrolling from police officers based at Bow Street Police Station a few minutes away. It attracts hostile attention of newspapers like John Bull, who see it as a den of vice and iniquity that should be removed from the heart of London. So the kind of the focus on the cafe as a problem, as a centre of crime and vice, reflects the kind of wider rhetoric, the wider moral panic around race and nationality in Britain in the 1920s.
Continuing on from what you were saying about the cafe creating a cultural hub, how did the clubs, cafes, or the nightlife influence the culture and reputation of Seven Dials?
Yeah. Seven Dials, in the context of Seven Dials, the cafe, it's one of the few venues that are run by a Black business owner. But it sits alongside cafes, restaurants, eating houses, butchers, and other shops run by Eastern European Jewish migrants, by recent migrants from across Italy, increasingly from people who have left Greece and Cyprus in the 1930s. It's a neighborhood cafe. These are all neighborhood eating places. They never really make it into the pages of urban guidebooks or Baedeker. You don't get restaurant critics or even intrepid urban slummers going to the cafes and eating houses of Seven Dials in the way that they do to Soho. But these are all places that cater for their local community, be that people from the Italian community coming to gather and exchange news and gossip with their compatriots, be they Black or Asian sailors and students passing through Britain, coming for Jim and Emily Kitten's rice and curry and afternoon tea. This is part of the hustle and bustle of everyday life in a cosmopolitan working class area. They do have an effect on how the neighbourhood is understood. I think the important thing about Seven Dials in the 20s and 30s is that the way that people talk about it and think about it, from newspaper proprietors, journalists to police and politicians, is defined by Seven Dials' history as a Victorian slum, one of the poorest parts of London, associated with crime and vice and poverty and depravity from the 18th century through to the end of the 19th century. Now, Seven Dials isn't quite like that. By the 1910s, the 1920s, it's becoming increasingly respectable, even at the same time as all the buildings begin to decay and fall apart. But the way that people look at it is still shaped by the idea that it's somehow a dark spot at the centre of London. And that's really important. I think what the raids on the Kitten's Cafe do, and what the raids on clubs run by Russian or Italian entrepreneurs do, is slowly reinforce this sense that Seven Dials is a dodgy, disreputable neighbourhood on the edges of the West End. So every time there's a raid on a nightclub on Great St Andrew Street, every time there's a prosecution that relates to one of Jim and Emily Kitten's customers, it's reported in the news, and the effect of this drip of newspaper reporting is to cement a particular image of Seven Dials as a problem that needs to be fixed. And in lots of ways, that reporting and the prosecution of the nightlife it plays into the hands of property developers and politicians. Like, they see an opportunity in Seven Dials, an opportunity for gentrification, an opportunity to make money in Seven Dials. And the more that it's defined as a problem by newspaper reporting and court cases, the stronger the case they can make for either redeveloping the whole area or demolishing the whole thing and rebuilding it from scratch.
Yeah. When you were mentioning about that drip, is about the history of Seven Dials and how it reveals about the early forms of gentrification in London. Everything seemed to be pointing in one particular direction. By 1910, it was tidying itself up. Communities were being created, and yet there's a big clash now from existing and then this gentrification that's going to be forced upon them by eradicating certain problems.
Yeah, exactly. The big moment, I think, one of the defining moments is around 1919, 1920, when politicians and planners from Holborn Borough Council put forward these grand plans to demolish Seven Dials and build it again. And the idea is that out of this sort of tangle of courts and yards and streets, that it will create a grand plaza that will rival Piccadilly Circus. And there will be 5 dials. There will be these big thoroughfares where cars can speed through. There will be these monumental island blocks where there will be offices and department stores. That Seven Dials will become what Kingsway became a decade or so earlier. And these plans are launched to great fanfare in 1920. Now, of course, they come to nothing. They quickly run up against the problem that there's very little money in local government in London at the start of the 1920s. There's not enough funding to make the plans happen. They get bogged down in the Byzantine conflicts between the London County Council, Westminster Borough Council to the south, and Holborn. And then they fizzle away. But there's a period between 1920 and still in the late 1920s when everyone just assumes that Seven Dials is going to be demolished and go completely. And I think that's the really important context for what happens around the cafe. That's a sort of signal for theatrical entrepreneurs or property developers or hotel owners to look at Seven Dials as a place where they can make money, that they know it's going to be redeveloped. There are these grand plans to do something with it. So that it's a place where it makes sense for them to invest. And you can see that playing out for a period of several years when estate agents adverts, every time they advertise one of the corner blocks on the Seven Dials itself for sale, they will talk quite explicitly about how this is a big development opportunity, particularly because of the grand plans for changing the area. When those plans collapse by the late 1920s, and Holborn Council becomes more interested in Bloomsbury, the area around the Foundling Hospital, as a kind of a site for preservation and redevelopment, I think what happens is Seven Dials is quietly forgotten. But there's no sense, no vision for what it should be. It just becomes a problem to manage through public health intervention, by looking at the state of the buildings, by police, so on. And so it just continues to decline gradually all the way through to the 1960s and the 1970s, where there's another grand plan to redevelop Covent Garden and Seven Dials, another moment when politicians want to demolish the whole area and start again. But at that point, a successful campaign to preserve this sort of historic quarter of central London.
So what were some of the biggest myths about Seven Dials in popular imagination, and also how does your research challenge them?
When historians think about Seven Dials, they might think about two things. Either that moment between its 17th century foundation and the late 19th century, where a grand plan development turns into a notorious slum. Or they might skip forward to the period since the 1970s, when housing activists, preservationists, local communities fought a successful campaign to preserve Seven Dials from the attention of the Greater London Council. And then Seven Dials became the kind of gentrified, upscale consumerist paradise that it is today. And what I wanted to do, I guess, in the book was to look at the bit in between those two moments and think about what's going on in Seven Dials in the 1920s and the 1930s. Because it's not really something that's a part of the popular history of the area. But I think if we start to look closely at Seven Dials in the 20s and 30s, it gives us a way of understanding changes that are taking place across London in this period. And I think that was the main thing for me, writing this book about Seven Dials, not so much to challenge myths about the area itself, but to challenge some of the pervasive myths that still govern how we think about the 1920s and 30s and their place in modern British history.
So how did the local and national newspapers shape the perception of Seven Dials, both within London and beyond? Because I know whenever I look at history, I always jump onto what the newspapers were saying, but that doesn't necessarily give me an overall viewpoint.
Yeah, if you look at newspaper reports of Seven Dials in the period that I've looked at it, you would very much get the sense that it was a declining slum. A lot of reports of court cases, some attention to the grand plans to redevelop the area in the early 1920s, but then not very much, actually, after that. I suppose one of the interesting things, I talked before about how often Seven Dials was disappeared from view in the 1920s and 30s. And that happens in newspapers to quite a striking degree. It's often the kind of shorthand labels that people used to do, that journalists used to describe it. They often treat it as part of Soho, part of Covent Garden, as sort of part of the fringes of Bloomsbury. And I think one of the things that I wanted to do in the book is to show how it is a very distinctive area, that it seeps into all of these better known neighborhoods around it. But there's something very distinctive about Seven Dials in terms of its population, in terms of the balance between residential community and the kind of the businesses, the manufacturing business that are taking place there, and also its cosmopolitanism. I think that isn't necessarily something you get a sense of from reading contemporary newspapers.
Are there any personal stories or characters from your research that really particularly struck you or stayed with you?
Yeah, there's one place, actually, and the people who inhabit it that really stick with me. So the place is a small tenement of 5 Lumber Court, which is just tucked away behind the main streets in Seven Dials. And Lumber Court is probably one of the poorest areas of Seven Dials from the 19th century onwards. When Charles Booth's social investigator passed through there in the 1890s, they're struck by the presence of what they describe as prostitutes and bullies and thieves. And it's poor, it's run down, and it's a sort of tiny alleyway in lots of ways. And I think in the book, I got really interested in, like I said, number 5 Lumber Court. In the 1920s, it's rented by a woman called Nellie Reggiani, who's born in South London and then is married and then remarries Victor Reggiani, who's from the Italian-speaking part of Switzerland. And they live together in this house for maybe perhaps 2 decades. And in the 1921 census, which Nellie Reggiani completes the return, it's clear that she's running this as a boarding house. And it's a boarding house where almost all of the people living there on the sort of 3 or 4 floors are young women. They're young women who have either to Seven Dials from suburban London or Ireland or the north of England and beyond. And they've come to do the kind of low-paying service industry or manufacturing jobs that sort of that keep London going, that in many ways make the mass culture of the 1920s. So there are a couple of young women who work in the Lambert and Butler cigarette factory just to the southeast of Seven Dials. There's the dance instructress Connie O'Toole in her early 20s who works at Brett's Dancing Club on Shaftesbury Avenue. There are milliners and seamstresses and all of these kind of jobs. The unseen work of the 1920s is in this house at 5 Lumber Court. I think it's really interesting because it gives us another way of thinking about the modern woman or the flapper of the 1920s. That when we think of this period, our temptation is to think straight away of the kind of brutal glamour and hedonism of the scantily dressed jazzing flapper in her silk stockings and short dresses and cloche hats and all the rest of it. And in some ways, you can find that version of the modern woman of the 1920s in 5 Lumber Court. Connie O'Toole is a nightclub hostess. She's employed at one point in the venue run by Mrs. Kate Merrick, one of the most famous nightclub owners of the 1920s, and the inspiration
And
for
an
the BBC.
episode about Kate, yes.
Yeah. So the inspiration for the BBC TV show Dope Girls.
Yeah.
So Connie O'Toole, she fits with that story, right? So her job is to look glamorous, to teach men to dance, and to charm them out of their hard-earned income. And there are some of her other friends who live in the boarding house in Lumber Court are clearly part of that world as well. But I think when you look at the census records, you get a sense of how the 1920s isn't just about glamour and fashion and nightlife. It's also about new economic opportunities for young working class women, new industries, and crucially, it's about work. So the story of the 20s, if you start from Lumber Court, it's not about hedonism or glamour. It's about expropriation and exploitation of young women's labor. And I think that story is much more challenging in lots of ways. The two women who worked in Lambert and Butler cigarette factory that I talked about, when the 1921 census is taken that June, they're both out of work. And they're out of work because of the national economic slump that has rippled across mostly northern England and Wales and Scotland, but it's also rippled across central London and leaves a huge number of men and women working in precarious roles in the service industry or manufacturing out of work in that time. So there's a story there about economic hardship, a story about making ends meet and finding somewhere to live as an independent woman in a strange city. There's also a story in 5 Lumber Court about the dangers or the tragedy of the nightlife of central London. A year after the 1921 census is taken, one of Nellie Reggiani's boarders, a young woman called Cordelia May Davis, is found dead in her room by her roommate after taking an overdose of cocaine. And the story becomes one of these sort of moral panics, these cause célèbres about the dangers of Seven Dials, the dangers of black men selling drugs to young white women, of moral corruption and contagion. But it's a reminder, I think, of the darker side of the nightlife of the 1920s. So I think that's probably that. It's that sort of example. It's that really drove me into, it made me interested in Number 5 Lumber Court. I think I could talk about this for ages if you let me go on. I think the other interesting thing in Lumber Court about this address and about Nellie Reggiani is that she appears in the autobiography of a remarkable woman called Mabel Lethbridge, written in the 1930s. Mabel Lethbridge goes on to be a fairly well-known writer, Britain's first female estate agent. But she's born in 1900. At the end of the Great War, she's involved in a horrific explosion in a munitions factory that leaves her, that means that she loses her leg and her hearing and is in just excruciating pain, chronic pain for the rest of her life. But in the early 1920s, after this accident, Mabel Lethbridge finds her way to Seven Dials and finds her way at one point to Nellie Reggiani's boarding house. So you can see from Lethbridge's autobiography that she's aware of Seven Dials' reputation, that it's supposed to be this sort of den of vice and iniquity and a terrible slum. But for her, the way that she experiences it is a kind of place of warmth, of community, of a kind of an authentic welcome that she doesn't find anywhere else in her life in this period. And so she's got these amazing accounts of sitting in Nellie Reggiani's kitchen, looking out for the rate collector, but also of just the kind of the welcome that she finds in Seven Dials in this period. I think that too, if you put these different things together, 1921 census, this remarkable autobiographical account, you just really start to get a different sense of what Seven Dials was like, but also what the 1920s and 1930s were like.
Fantastic. So, listeners, if that has whetted your appetite to learn more about Seven Dials in the 1920s and 30s, then Matt Holbrooke's book, Songs of Seven Dials, An Intimate History of 1920s and 1930s London, is out now. Thank you very much, Matt. It's been brilliant.
Well, thank you for having me.